In the small town of Ridgeway, Grace Whitaker is known for her quiet strength and boundless kindness. A retired teacher with a warm smile and a heart full of compassion, she's spent her life helping others without asking for anything in return. But even the kindest hearts can face the harshest trials. One ordinary morning, as Grace runs a simple errand to help a sick neighbor, her life is suddenly turned upside down. A routine act of kindness becomes the catalyst for a public confrontation with Officer Jason Grayson, an officer whose assumptions lead to an unjust and humiliating encounter. In a matter of moments, Grace finds herself at the center of a storm, surrounded by fearful bystanders, accusations, and a system that seems to have forgotten what justice really means. What unfolds next is a story of resilience, as Grace, armed only with her unwavering dignity and the support of her community, faces not just one man's prejudice, but the challenge of inspiring a town to see the truth and themselves more clearly. But will courage and integrity be enough to turn fear into unity? How does a quiet act of defiance grow into a movement for change? The early morning light stretched across the sleepy town of Ridgeway, dappling the quiet streets with a soft, golden glow. Birds chirped as the town slowly awakened. Grace Whitaker stood at her kitchen window, a warm cup of tea nestled between her hands. She had always found this time of day peaceful, a moment to reflect before life's demands set in. Her modest home on Maple Street was small, but filled with mementos of a life well lived. Framed photographs of her former students and handwritten thank you notes decorated the shelves, each a testament to her decades as a beloved teacher. At 65, Grace had settled comfortably into retirement. Though she had no children of her own, she found immense joy in helping her neighbors and former students whenever she could. Today's task was simple but important, picking up groceries for Clara Thompson, an elderly neighbor who had been bedridden with the flu. Grace grabbed her purse from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-covered grass. Her old sedan, a silver Buick that had seen better days, waited for her at the curb. She patted the hood affectionately. "Still going strong, huh?" she murmured with a smile before climbing in. The streets of Ridgeway were quiet as she made her way to the pharmacy. Small-town life had its charms, familiar faces at every corner, shopkeepers who knew her by name, and neighbors who waved from their porches. But the town was not without its flaws. Beneath the surface of warm greetings and friendly chatter, there were unspoken tensions. Grace had seen it in fleeting glances and overheard conversations. Still, she believed in the goodness of people. That belief had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. Grace pulled into the small parking lot behind the pharmacy and turned off the engine. As she stepped out of the car, the aroma of freshly baked biscuits from the nearby diner wafted through the air, tempting her to stop for breakfast. Just as she reached for the pharmacy door, she noticed a young mother struggling to calm her crying toddler. The boy, red-faced and squirming, clutched his small fists tightly. Without a second thought, Grace approached with a warm smile. "You look like you could use a hand," she said gently. The young mother hesitated, her eyes tired and wary. Grace knelt down, her calm voice soothing as she spoke to the boy. "Hey there, sweetheart. It is going to be okay." The boy's cries quieted as he stared at Grace with wide, curious eyes. The mother exhaled a deep sigh of relief. "Thank you so much. I have not slept in days." Grace handed back the diaper bag she had picked up to help. "You are doing a great job," she reassured her. The mother's eyes welled up with gratitude as she nodded. Just then, the sound of screeching tires shattered the quiet morning. Grace turned to see a patrol car pulling into the lot, the engine revving aggressively before coming to a sudden stop behind her sedan. The door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, his expression stern. His nameplate read, "Officer Jason Grayson." "Hey, you! Hands where I can see them!" he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Grace froze, her pulse quickening. Confused, She raised her hand slightly. The young mother, frightened by the commotion, quickly scooped up her child and hurried away. Grace tried to keep her voice steady. "Officer, is there a problem?" Grayson's eyes swept over her and her car with a look of suspicion. "There have been reports of break-ins in this area," he said flatly. "That old car of yours fits the description of a vehicle used in one of them." Grace's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "This is my car. I have had it for years, and it is fully registered." Grayson's expression did not soften. "License and registration," he demanded. Grace reached slowly into her purse, careful not to make any sudden movements. She handed over her documents, her hands trembling slightly. Grayson barely glanced at them before gesturing toward her car. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal in broad daylight sank deep into Grace's bones. She stood her ground, though her mind raced with disbelief. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. A few passers-by had gathered near the diner's window, watching with curiosity and unease. "Officer, please," Grace said quietly. "I am just here to pick up groceries for a neighbor." Grayson's lips thinned with impatience. "I said step away." Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her toward the patrol car. Grace gasped, nearly losing her balance. The murmurs from the onlookers grew louder, but no one dared to intervene. The officer's partner stood by the squad car, one hand resting near his holster, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. Tears pricked the corners of Grace's eyes, not from fear alone, but from the sting of injustice. She had spent her life teaching others about kindness and fairness, believing in the strength of community. And now, here she was, manhandled and humiliated by someone sworn to protect. Just as Grayson moved to shove her against the hood of his patrol car, a voice rang out across the lot. "Hey, that is enough!" The crowd parted as Mr. Reynolds, the local pharmacist, stepped forward. His usually gentle demeanor was replaced by a look of fierce determination. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Officer, you need to let her go. You clearly have no idea who she is." Grayson's grip loosened slightly as he turned, his brows furrowing in confusion. Grace blinked, her heart still pounding in her chest. A ripple of murmurs passed through the small crowd, a shift in the air as if the town itself was holding its breath. Grace felt her shoulders straighten as hope flickered within her. She knew this moment was far from over, but something had changed. She was not alone. The world felt muted as Grace Whitaker stood in place, her wrists sore from Grayson's grip. The murmuring of the crowd and the steady hum of passing cars became background noise. Her heart still thudded in her chest, but she drew in a slow, steadying breath. Mr. Reynolds stepped closer, his face pale but resolute. The years of familiarity between him and Grace flashed in the air like an unspoken shield. He repeated, firmer this time, "Let her go." Officer Grayson hesitated, the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on him. A few more bystanders emerged from nearby stores, their eyes wide with disbelief. Grayson's jaw tightened as he scanned the growing audience. The pharmacist's words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence except for the rustling wind. Then, as though shaken from a trance, Grayson's grip slackened, though he did not release Grace completely. Grace took the opportunity to slowly pull her arm free, massaging the spot where his fingers had dug into her skin. She raised her head, determined not to appear broken. Though her shoulders trembled, she squared them with quiet dignity. "I deserve to know why I am being treated this way," she said, her voice steady, though quieter than she wanted. Grayson narrowed his eyes, his authority challenged in front of everyone. His voice came out colder, almost defensive. "We've had reports of break-ins around here. Older cars like this," he gestured at her sedan, "are usually linked to stolen property. I have every right to check." Grace's eyes didn't waver. "Then check properly without accusing innocent people. Grayson's face reddened as a few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. His partner, Officer Michaels, who had been lingering by the car, finally stepped forward. His unease was obvious in the way he avoided eye contact. "Maybe we could run the plates again," Michaels muttered, his hand dropping away from his holster. The tension in the air was palpable. The young mother Grace had helped earlier peeked around the pharmacy door, clutching her toddler tightly to her chest. Her expression flickered between worry and guilt. Grace noticed her and gave a small nod as if to say, "It's all right." A voice in the crowd called out, "She's been living here for years. What's this nonsense?" It was Mr. Carlson, the diner owner, wiping his hands on his apron as he stepped out from his front steps. His voice carried more authority than anyone had expected. Grayson clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. He was outnumbered, outvoiced, but he wouldn't back down without a fight. "We're just doing our jobs," he snapped, though the defensiveness in his tone betrayed his frustration. Grace took a slow step forward. The crowd grew quiet, watching her. Her voice was calm but sharp with resolve. "There is a difference between doing your job and abusing your power." She let the words hang for a moment, unflinching as Grayson's glare darkened. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside Grayson, glancing between Grace and the gathered crowd. His unease was now written all over his face. "Jason," he whispered, barely loud enough for the closest bystanders to hear, "we're making a scene." Grayson ignored him. His pride wouldn't let him admit his mistake. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared Grace down. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to charge you for obstruction." The crowd let out a collective gasp. Grace could feel their unease growing stronger. A part of her wanted to lash out, to shout at him, to tell him exactly how unjust and humiliating this was. But she knew better. She had spent a lifetime teaching Child to rise above moments of unfairness, and she wouldn't abandon that lesson now. Her voice remained low, but firm. Obstruction? For picking up groceries for a sick neighbor? For helping a mother with her child? She shook her head slowly. "I think you've mistaken compassion for a crime." Michael shifted again, this time more forcefully. "She's right, Jason. We can't—" He stopped short, as if realizing how far things had gone. "We should let this one go." Grayson shot him a glare but didn't argue. Instead, he took a step back, barely masking his anger. The faint glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes didn't go unnoticed by Grace or anyone else. From behind the small gathering, a familiar figure emerged: Paul Anderson, a local attorney known for his calm demeanor and fierce advocacy for justice. He approached slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his suit pristine despite the morning breeze. "Grace?" Paul's voice was steady but gentle, as if asking if she was holding up. The moment Grace saw him, her shoulders softened just slightly. Relief washed over her like a quiet wave. Grayson noticed Paul's presence and scowled. "What's this? Another witness?" Paul's expression didn't change. He stepped between Grace and the officers, addressing Grayson directly. "Not just another witness. I am also the person who appointed Miss Whitaker as our new magistrate judge last month." His voice was calm, but carried undeniable authority. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. Even the breeze seemed to stop for a second. Michaels took an instinctive step back, as if realizing the full gravity of the situation. Grayson's face went pale, his self-assured facade cracking. Paul continued, his tone unwavering. "You didn't recognize her, did you? You assumed she was someone else." He let the implication linger. "Someone you didn't think deserved your respect." Grayson tried to recover. I was just doing my duty." Paul folded his arms. "Your duty does not include violating someone's rights." Grace met Paul's gaze, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. She hadn't wanted to be the center of a spectacle, but here she was. The crowd shifted, murmuring quietly among themselves. Many faces showed a mixture of anger, disbelief, and shame, not directed at Grace, but at the reality of what had unfolded. The young mother stepped forward at last, her toddler now calm in her arms. Her voice was soft but clear. "She's the kindest person I've ever met. She was just helping me. She didn't deserve this." Grayson's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of everything pressed down on him. Grace saw it, the slow unraveling of his certainty, but she wasn't done. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "This town deserves protectors, not bullies." The crowd's quiet agreement rippled through the lot. Grayson swallowed hard, as though the truth was something too difficult to digest. Beside him, Michaels murmured something unintelligible and looked away. The shift in the air was undeniable. Grace could feel it. For the first time in the ordeal, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. The silence that followed Paul Anderson's words was deafening. Grace Whitaker stood rooted to the spot, the morning sun casting a halo of light around her gray curls. Her breathing had steadied, though her heart still felt like a drumbeat in her chest. Officer Grayson's face had gone slack with shock. His partner, Michaels, looked down at his shoes, visibly uncomfortable. The crowd watched with rapt attention, the weight of their collective gaze like a spotlight on Grayson. Paul turned slightly, his calm eyes meeting Grace's. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded, though the soreness in her wrist was a sharp reminder of the ordeal. "I'll be fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed the weariness beneath her resolve. Grayson's jaw tensed as he tried to regain his composure. He pointed toward Grace's old sedan as if clinging to a shred of justification. "That car, it still fits the description of a vehicle connected to break-ins." Paul's expression didn't waver. "Is that so?" He stepped closer to the car and gestured toward the license plate. "Run it again, Michaels. Let's see what it comes back as." Michaels hesitated, but then gave a quick nod. He moved back toward the squad car and began typing into the computer, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. Grace could see the nervous bounce of his knee as he waited for the system to respond. The beep of confirmation came quicker than expected. Michaels cleared his throat. "The vehicle is registered to Grace Whitaker, fully insured. No outstanding issues." Grayson's scowl deepened, the thin veneer of authority he had wrapped himself in beginning to fray. "Fine," he muttered. "But this area has had trouble before, and someone like her." He stopped mid-sentence, as though realizing too late the direction his words had taken. Paul raised an eyebrow. "Someone like her?" The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Grace heard a man near the back whisper, "Unbelievable." Grace's gaze sharpened as she stepped forward, facing Grayson head-on. "I have lived in this town for over 30 years, she said, her voice ringing with quiet strength. "I taught half the children in Ridgeway how to read and write. I've spent my life believing in this community, even on days when it has not believed in me." Grayson blinked, momentarily speechless. Grace could feel the tremor in her hands, but she clasped them in front of her, willing them to be still. She wasn't just speaking to Grayson anymore. She was speaking to everyone. "I was picking up groceries for a sick neighbor," she continued. "I helped a mother calm her child. And because I drive an old car and don't fit your assumptions, you decided I must be guilty of something." Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the young mother from earlier stepped forward, her toddler still resting quietly on her hip. She spoke softly but firmly. "She was helping me. I was overwhelmed, and she came to my aid without asking for anything in return." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Is that what criminals do?" The crowd murmured in agreement, nods passing from person to person, like ripples in a pond. Mr. Reynolds, the pharmacist, crossed his arms and spoke up again. "This is Evelyn Whitaker we're talking about. If you don't know her character, that's your failing, not hers." Michaels shifted on his feet and glanced at Grayson. "Maybe we should "Let her go," he said, his voice low but audible. Grace watched as the cracks in Grayson's armor widened. His authority, once wielded so carelessly, now felt as flimsy as paper. He tried again to assert control. "I didn't mean—" His voice faltered as he looked around at the expectant faces of the crowd. The weight of their judgment was palpable. Paul Anderson folded his arms. "You didn't mean to what, Officer Grayson? You didn't mean to accuse an innocent woman of a crime because of her appearance? You didn't mean to escalate the situation when all she did was ask a question?" Grayson's face flushed with anger and shame. He took a small step back, as if trying to physically retreat from the conversation. But Paul's voice followed him. "You have two choices right now, officer. You can admit you were wrong, or you can double down and make things worse for yourself." The air grew thick with anticipation. Grayson's hands curled into fists at his sides before slowly releasing. "I was following procedure," he muttered weakly. "No," Paul countered, his voice calm but unyielding. "You were following your own assumptions." Grace felt the sting of those words, not because they were wrong, but because they were painfully true. She knew this wasn't the first time someone had judged her unfairly, but it was the first time it had played out so publicly. Grayson took another step back, looking smaller with each passing second. His partner cleared his throat and spoke softly. "We should just let her go, Jason. This isn't worth it." Grayson shot Michaels a glare but didn't argue. Instead, he looked back at Grace, his face twisted with resentment and something else, perhaps regret. "You're free to go," he said reluctantly. Grace exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. But she didn't move. Not yet. She raised her chin and spoke directly to the crowd. "I didn't ask for this to happen, but now that it has, we need to remember something. Respect isn't optional. It isn't something you only give to people you think deserve it. It's something you show to everyone." She paused, letting her words settle. "Especially when you wear a badge." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding. The crowd had come together, not just to witness injustice, but to call it out. One by one, the murmurs grew into words of support. "She's right. We deserve better." Grayson's face was a mask of defeat as he turned toward his squad car. Michaels followed but paused briefly to glance at Grace. He looked almost apologetic before he slid into the passenger seat. The car doors closed, and the patrol car slowly pulled away. The silence broke as the young mother turned to Grace, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Grace gave her a soft smile, though the weariness still clung to her. Mr. Reynolds placed a hand on her shoulder. "We've got your back, Grace." Paul nodded. "We're not letting this go." Grace's gaze swept over the faces of her neighbors, some familiar, some strangers. "Neither am I," she said quietly. The sound of the patrol car fading into the distance left the parking lot in an eerie silence. The crowd that had gathered stood motionless, as if they were unsure what to do next. Grace Whitaker remained where she was, steady but tired. Her wrist still throbbed, though the emotional weight of the encounter felt heavier than any physical pain. Paul Anderson, the local attorney who had spoken up for her, took a step closer. His steady presence was a reminder that not everyone with power used it to intimidate. Grace offered him a small, grateful nod. "Are you sure you're all right?" Paul asked, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of distress. "I'm fine," Grace said, though her voice was quieter than usual. "But this can't keep happening." Paul nodded. "It won't not, if I can help it." The gathered crowd had begun murmuring softly among themselves. Some looked ashamed for staying quiet so long, while others whispered reassurances to each other. A few faces pressed to the glass of the nearby diner, watching as the scene unfolded. Then, a familiar voice rang out, cutting through the noise like a clarion call. "Excuse me, everyone." Mr. Reynolds, the pharmacist, took a bold step forward, his eyes fierce beneath his thick glasses. I think we've seen enough to know something has to change. This is not who we are. He gestured toward Grace. This woman has given more to this community than most of us ever will. If she isn't safe from this kind of treatment, none of us are. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Grace felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. Mr. Reynolds had always been kind, but to see him speak with such conviction made her realize that sometimes the quietest people had the loudest hearts. The young mother Grace had helped earlier stepped forward, still holding her toddler close. "She didn't have to help me," the woman said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "But she did. She was kind when she didn't have to be, and all she got in return was suspicion and rough treatment." Heads began nodding, and voices of agreement followed. "She's right. Enough is enough." Grace's heart swelled, but she knew this moment wasn't about her alone. It was about something larger, about the fear and mistrust that had settled over the town like a heavy fog. Paul raised a hand, calling for quiet. "We need to make our voices heard," he said, "but not with anger, with action. We cannot let this moment fade away like it never happened. We must demand accountability." Mr. Reynolds nodded in agreement. "We should go to the mayor. Let her know what happened here today. The town deserves answers." A few people shifted uncomfortably at the thought of confronting authority, but most seemed emboldened by the pharmacist's words. Grace took a slow step forward, addressing them all. "I don't want anyone to feel powerless. This isn't about vengeance. It's about dignity. I've lived in Ridgeway for more than 3 decades. I've watched children grow into adults here. I've seen neighbors come together during storms and heartache, and I still believe in the goodness of this town." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But belief isn't enough. We have to do more than hope for change. We have to demand it. Today wasn't just about me. It was a reminder that kindness and respect must go both ways." The crowd's murmurs of agreement grew louder. People who had once been passive bystanders now stood tall with conviction. Paul took out his phone and began making notes. "I'll draft a formal complaint," he said. "If any of you witnessed what happened, I encourage you to come forward. We'll take this to the mayor's office and make sure it's handled properly." "I'll be there," Mr. Reynolds said without hesitation. "Grace deserves that much, and so do we." The young mother raised her hand timidly. "I'll testify too. What I saw, it wasn't right." Grace felt a deep gratitude welling up inside her. She had been so close to feeling alone in that moment of injustice, yet now she was surrounded by support and courage. The bystanders who had once stayed silent were beginning to find their voices. A tall man with a worn denim jacket stepped forward. Grace recognized him as Mr. Jenkins, a carpenter known for his quiet nature. "If anyone needs me, I'll stand with you," he said gruffly, as if speaking made him uncomfortable but necessary. Another voice chimed in, a young college student who had been sitting at the diner window. "Me too. I recorded the whole thing." He held up his phone, the screen showing the paused footage of the confrontation. Grace blinked in surprise. She had assumed most of the bystanders had simply been watching passively, but this young man had taken action in his own way. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Paul clapped a hand on the student's shoulder. "That footage could make a real difference." The student nodded. It felt wrong not to do something. Grace exhaled slowly. The weight in her chest was still there, but it was no longer crushing. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt hope. The group began to disperse slowly, people exchanging numbers and offering promises to show up at the town hall meeting. Mr. Reynolds lingered by Grace's side, his expression softening. "You've always been a light in this community, Grace. It's about time we reflected some of that back at you." Grace smiled, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you, Henry. That means more than you know." Paul glanced at his watch. "We should get moving. The sooner we file the complaint, the better. Grace nodded, but paused, looking back at the pharmacy parking lot where everything had unfolded. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the asphalt. But the darkness couldn't hide what had happened, and it couldn't diminish the courage that had emerged because of it. As they began to walk toward the town square, Grace felt the warmth of the sun on her back. It wasn't just a new day, it was the beginning of something bigger. The walk to the town square was quiet at first. Grace Whitaker felt the weight of every step, but with each passing moment, the silent presence of those walking with her became a steadying force. Mr. Reynolds walked by her side, his expression a mix of resolve and quiet pride. Paul Anderson kept pace, already drafting notes on his phone. The young mother carried her sleeping toddler close, and the college student with the video footage walked a few steps behind, nervously clutching his phone. By the time they reached the square, more townsfolk had joined them, shop owners closing early, a retired couple who had heard the commotion, even a group of high school students who had spread the news on social media. The trickle of people had grown into a steady stream, all heading toward the mayor's office with a single purpose. Grace glanced around, overwhelmed by the sight. This was the same community that had once quietly turned away when they saw injustice. Now, they stood with her. The mayor's office was located in the old courthouse building, a brick structure with ivy trailing up its sides. Mayor Caldwell, a practical woman in her late 40s, was standing just inside when they entered. Alerted by the growing crowd, she stepped out with a furrowed brow and folded arms. Her expression shifted as she noticed Grace at the forefront. "Grace, what's going on?" the mayor asked, concern flickering in her brown eyes. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Paul Anderson spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "Mayor Caldwell, we're here to file a formal complaint against Officer Jason Grayson for misconduct and harassment." He handed over a preliminary statement he had typed up. The mayor scanned the page, her frown deepening as murmurs from the crowd filled the space behind them. "Is this about what happened outside the pharmacy?" "Yes," Paul replied. He gestured toward Grace. Grace was wrongfully detained and publicly humiliated without cause. The situation was completely unjustified. The mayor's gaze shifted to Grace, softening with familiarity. "I'm so sorry, Grace, I had no idea." Grace raised a hand gently. "I appreciate that, but this isn't about me alone. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The young mother stepped forward hesitantly. "She's right. If someone like Grace, someone kind, patient, and giving can be treated like this, what does that mean for the rest of us?" Her voice trembled, but didn't break. The mayor's eyes moved across the crowd, taking in their resolute expressions. Paul continued, "We have witnesses, including video evidence." The college student stepped forward and raised his phone. "I recorded everything," he said, "from the moment the officers pulled up until they drove away." The mayor took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper Paul had given her. "I see." A heavy pause followed, then she nodded. "I will handle this personally." Relief passed through the room like a collective exhale. Grace's shoulders loosened, though she wasn't done yet. "Thank you, Mayor Caldwell," she said, "but I want to be sure this doesn't get lost in the system. We need more than promises, we need action." The mayor's gaze didn't waver. "You have my word. There will be an internal investigation, and I will make sure it's thorough." She turned toward one of her aides. "Call the chief of police. I want a meeting scheduled immediately." The crowd murmured with approval, but Grace knew that words alone wouldn't erase the fear or frustration many felt. As the crowd began to thin, people lingered to offer their support. Mr. Jenkins, the carpenter, approached Grace and placed a rough hand on her shoulder. "I'm not one for speeches, but if you need me, I'll be there." Grace smiled warmly. "Thank you, John." The young mother gently touched Grace's arm. "You didn't just help me today. You reminded me that standing up matters. I won't forget that." Paul stepped beside Grace as they watched the remaining townsfolk head back toward the square. "You've always been someone people look up to," he said. "But today you showed this town what resilience really looks like." Grace let the words sink in, though humility kept her from embracing them fully. "I didn't do this alone," she said. "It was all of us together." Just as they began to walk out of the office, they heard someone calling Grace's name. They turned to see a familiar figure hurrying up the steps. It was Eleanor Finch, a retired librarian known for her sharp wit and love of justice. Eleanor's silver hair glimmered in the sunlight as she caught her breath. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice slightly breathless. "I heard what happened. You took a stand, Grace." Grace nodded, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, it's about time." Grace let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even her. Eleanor leaned closer. "You've always had a strong voice, you just needed a reason to use it." Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Eleanor." The mayor's aide returned and handed a paper to Mayor Caldwell, who looked over it briefly before turning back to the small group still gathered. "The police chief has agreed to meet tomorrow morning," she announced. "I'll keep you updated." Grace nodded. "We'll be there." The mayor's eyes softened again as she looked at Grace. "Thank you for reminding us who we're supposed to be." As they stepped outside, the late morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. The tension that had clung to Grace since the incident at the pharmacy finally began to lift. She took a deep breath, the fresh air filling her lungs. Paul glanced at her as they walked down the steps. "How do you feel?" Grace paused and looked around at the familiar streets of Ridgeway. "Hopeful," she said simply, "because today we didn't let fear win." Paul smiled, and the group began to part ways. The town square was still bustling with life children playing near the fountain, vendors setting up for the weekend market. Life was moving forward, and so was she. As Grace walked back toward her car, a few strangers waved and smiled at her faces. She didn't know well but who had seen what she stood for today. She returned their smiles, feeling the strength of a community that had come together not just for her, but for what was right. When she reached her car, she paused and looked up at the sky. The sun was bright and unwavering. She could feel its warmth on her skin, a reminder that even after the darkest clouds, light always returns. The morning sun climbed higher as Grace Whitaker eased into her car, the weight of the morning's events pressing heavily against her heart. She sat for a moment, hands resting on the worn steering wheel, and let the warmth from the sunlight settle over her like a quiet reassurance. The town square slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Neighbors chatted near the bakery, children raced across the grass, and shopkeepers opened their doors. Life was moving forward, but the shadows of what had happened still lingered. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She picked it up and saw a message from Paul. "We're all behind you, Grace. We're making progress, one step at a time." She smiled faintly and replied, "Thank you, Paul." The message was simple, but it reminded her that she was not alone in this. By the time she arrived home, the quiet hum of the morning had settled back over Maple Street. Grace took a deep breath as she unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cinnamon from a forgotten candle greeted her, wrapping her in comfort. She placed her keys on the counter and sat down at the small dining table, her mind replaying every moment of the confrontation with Officer Grayson. The memory of his words stung, "someone like her." The phrase echoed in her mind, a bitter reminder of the assumptions that had shaped the encounter. But beneath the sting, there was something else, something stronger. Determination. She reached for the stack of envelopes by the window, sorting through bills and letters until she found the notice she'd almost forgotten about, the upcoming town hall meeting. It was meant to discuss routine community concerns, but after today, Grace knew exactly what needed to be addressed. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Grace opened the door to find Mr. Reynolds standing there, a folder tucked under his arm. "I thought I'd drop by," he said with a sheepish smile. "I have the statements from a few witnesses who wanted to make sure their voices were included." Grace's heart warmed as she stepped aside to let him in. "Thank you, Henry." Mr. Reynolds set the folder on the table and looked around her cozy home, his gaze softening at the photos of former students and handmade cards lining the shelves. "This place suits you," he said after a pause. Grace smiled. "It's home." He nodded, then cleared his throat. "I thought you should know. More people are speaking up. What happened today opened a lot of eyes." Grace sat down, flipping through the statements in the folder. Each one was a small act of courage, ordinary people standing up against something they knew was wrong. "There's still so much work to be done," she murmured. Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses. "And it starts with people like you." Grace's gaze drifted to the window, where the sun filtered through the lace curtains. "It starts with all of us." The following morning, Grace arrived at the mayor's office with Paul, Mr. Reynolds, and the young mother, whose name she'd learned was Amy. Amy held her toddler close, a quiet determination replacing the nervousness in her eyes. The conference room was plain but bright, the morning light reflecting off the polished table. Mayor Caldwell greeted them with a nod, her expression calm but serious. Seated across from her was Chief Porter, the town's police chief, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weathered but thoughtful face. "Thank you all for coming," Mayor Caldwell began. She turned to Chief Porter. "Chief, we need to address what happened yesterday." Chief Porter folded his hands and nodded. "I've already reviewed the incident," he said. "The video footage made things very clear." He looked directly at Grace. "Miss Whitaker, on behalf of the department, I apologize. You should never have been treated that way." The sincerity in his voice caught Grace off guard. She had expected resistance, excuses, deflections, but there was none. "I appreciate your apology," Grace said, her voice measured. "But an apology alone won't change things. What happened wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem." Chief Porter's expression tightened with understanding. "I know," he said quietly, "which is why I've already begun making changes. Officer Grayson has been placed on suspension, pending a formal investigation." Paul leaned forward. "And what about the rest of the department? What steps are being taken to prevent this from happening again?" Chief Porter met his gaze steadily. "We've begun implementing mandatory training focused on bias awareness and de-escalation. I've also scheduled town hall sessions where residents can speak directly to officers. We need to rebuild trust." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of his words settled. Grace felt a flicker of hope. Mayor Caldwell turned to Grace. "I want you to know that your voice made this happen. This town is changing because you stood up." Grace's heart swelled, though she kept her composure. "I didn't do this alone," she said. "It was all of us, the bystanders who spoke up, the witnesses who came forward." She looked at Amy, who smiled softly. Amy spoke up, her voice steady. "It's easy to stay quiet when you're afraid. But Grace showed us that being quiet only makes the wrong things louder." Paul nodded in agreement. "This is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in a single meeting. It's something we have to keep working at, together." Chief Porter stood. "I promise you, this isn't just talk. We'll prove it through action." He extended his hand to Grace. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and shook it. "Thank you," she said quietly. As they filed out of the room, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt warmer somehow. Grace walked with a steady stride, her mind clearer than it had been in days. Outside the building, a small group of neighbors had gathered, waiting to hear the outcome. When they saw Grace, they began to clap not out of spectacle, but as a show of respect and gratitude. Grace paused, taken aback by the sight. Amy stepped beside her and whispered, "This is what you've done. You've reminded them that kindness and courage matter." Grace smiled as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She felt the strength of the community around her, their belief in what was right, their shared resilience. "Let's keep going," she said. "We're not done yet." The applause from the small group of neighbors outside the mayor's office felt humbling rather than celebratory. Grace Whitaker wasn't someone who sought attention. She'd spent a lifetime finding joy in small, quiet acts of kindness. But now, as she stood in the center of Ridgeway's growing call for change, she felt the full weight of what her stand had come to mean. Paul Anderson, walking beside her, leaned in. "You've started something important, Grace." She nodded slowly, watching the crowd begin to disperse. Some stayed behind to thank her, offering words of support as they passed. Mr. Jenkins, the carpenter, paused and tipped his hat. "You've done right by this town, Grace. We'll make sure this isn't forgotten." As the last of the group headed home, Amy stood with her toddler by the fountain, rocking him gently. Grace approached her, and they shared a quiet smile. "Are you all right?" Grace asked softly. Amy nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm still nervous, but I'm not afraid anymore." She looked at her son, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "I want him to grow up knowing that standing up for what's right matters." Grace's heart swelled at the younger woman's words. "He will," she assured her, "because you've shown him that already." They parted ways, and Grace made her way home, the streets of Ridgeway quiet in the afternoon light. When she reached her front steps, she paused, savoring the familiar creak of the wooden porch under her feet. Home had always been her safe haven, but today it felt different, stronger somehow, fortified by the courage of the people who had come together. The next morning, the town hall was packed. News of the police chief's announcement had spread quickly, and Ridgeway's residents had turned out in numbers no one had expected. The old building, with its wooden beams and long windows, was filled with a low hum of anticipation. Grace sat in the front row beside Paul and Mr. Reynolds, who had arrived early to save seats for Amy and the others who had come forward as witnesses. The young college student who had recorded the incident waved nervously from across the room. The mayor took her place at the podium, tapping the microphone to quiet the room. "Thank you all for coming," Mayor Caldwell began, her voice steady but somber. "Today is about accountability. It's about ensuring that what happened to Grace Whitaker never happens again in this town." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room, some of agreement, others more skeptical. Grace spotted a few officers seated in the back, their uniforms crisp, but their expressions tense. Chief Porter stepped up next, clearing his throat. "I won't stand here and make excuses," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "What happened was wrong. It should never have happened. And as police officers, we have a duty to protect, not to intimidate." A few heads nodded, but the room remained cautious. Ridgeway had heard apologies before. They wanted action. Paul rose and addressed the room, his voice calm but firm. "We've been given promises before. What matters now is whether those promises lead to real change." He gestured toward Grace. "People like Grace have spent their lives building this community quietly, humbly, with love and patience. They deserve better than empty reassurances." Grace felt the eyes of the room turn toward her. She hadn't planned to speak, but something inside her stirred the same quiet fire that had kept her steady the day before. Slowly, she stood and approached the microphone. The room stilled. She took a deep breath. "Yesterday," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "I was treated as though I was something less than what I am. I was judged by my appearance, not my actions, and for a moment, I felt small, invisible." She paused, scanning the room. But then, something happened. People spoke up. People who could have stayed silent chose to stand beside me. Grace's gaze moved across the crowd toward Amy, Mr. Reynolds, the college student, and even the police officers in the back. This isn't just about one bad day. It's about making sure that when we see something wrong, we have the courage to call it what it is. And more than that, it's about changing the way we treat each other, not with suspicion, but with respect. The room was silent, but the emotion was palpable. Grace took another breath. Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. But it starts with honesty and with people willing to take responsibility. She turned to Chief Porter. "You've taken the first step. Now, it's time to follow through." The chief nodded, his expression solemn. "We will." The mayor stepped forward again. "As part of this commitment, we'll be implementing a civilian oversight board to review incidents involving police conduct, and we'll be increasing transparency with regular reports and public meetings." There was a stir in the room, approval mixed with cautious optimism. Mr. Reynolds whispered to Paul, "That's a good start." The meeting continued with questions and suggestions from residents, some more heated than others. But by the end, there was a sense that the town was finally moving in the right direction. After the meeting adjourned, the crowd lingered outside the town hall. The afternoon sun was warm, and the air buzzed with conversation. Amy approached Grace, her eyes bright despite the long morning. "You were incredible," Amy said. Grace shook her head with a humble smile. "I just spoke the truth." "And that's what makes it powerful," Paul added as he joined them. "The truth can change everything." The young college student walked over, still clutching his phone. "Miss Whitaker," he said nervously, "if you ever need more support, I'm here." "We all are." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. You were brave yesterday. Don't forget that." As they talked, a figure approached from the side of the square, Officer Michaels, his expression uncertain but genuine. He hesitated before speaking. "Miss Whitaker, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." Grace studied his face, then gave a small nod. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Michaels nodded, looking both relieved and humbled. "Thank you," he said before walking back toward the station. Grace turned back to her friends, a sense of calm washing over her. The sun was bright overhead, and the laughter of children echoed from the park across the street. "We're not done yet," Paul reminded her with a smile. "No," Grace agreed, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "But we're on the right path." The warm hum of conversation lingered in the town square as people slowly made their way home. Grace Whitaker stood with Paul Anderson and Amy near the fountain, watching as the last few neighbors trickled out of the town hall. The meeting had been a step forward, but Grace's mind was already turning toward what lay ahead. Real change, she knew, would take more than policies on paper. It would take persistence, empathy, and a lot of listening. The late afternoon sunlight slanted across the square as Mayor Caldwell stepped out of the town hall doors, flanked by Chief Porter. The mayor's heels clicked against the brick pathway as she made her way over to Grace. The chief followed a few paces behind, his expression still serious but less rigid than before. "Grace," the mayor greeted, folding her hands in front of her. "Thank you again for what you said in there. I've been at this job for over a decade, but today felt different." Grace tilted her head slightly. "Different how?" The mayor let out a breath, her professional facade softening. "It felt like we were finally honest with each other and with ourselves." She turned toward the chief. "And I think it's time we continue that honesty." Chief Porter cleared his throat and stepped forward. He hesitated for a moment, meeting Grace's gaze directly. "Miss Whitaker, I owe you more than an apology. What happened to you was a failure, not just of one officer's judgment, but of a system that allowed it to happen." His voice was low but steady, each word carefully measured. "We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure that moving forward, no one else has to endure what you did." Grace nodded slowly. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "But it's not the last." The chief gave a small nod of agreement. "I've reached out to the Civilian Oversight Committee from the neighboring county. We're meeting with them next week to discuss best practices for rebuilding trust and transparency." Paul crossed his arms, an approving glint in his eyes. "That's a smart move. If the community sees accountability in action, they'll start to believe in it again." The mayor's gaze softened as she addressed Grace directly. "This town is stronger because of you. I hope you know that." Grace let the compliment sit for a moment, then responded with a quiet but firm, "This town is stronger because of everyone who spoke up." As the small group disbanded, Grace and Amy began the short walk back toward Maple Street. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the faint sound of children laughing in the park. Amy adjusted the strap of her diaper bag as her toddler babbled sleepily in her arms. "Can I ask you something?" Amy said after a moment of quiet. "Of course." Amy glanced down at her son before meeting Grace's eyes. "Were you ever scared? You always seemed so calm, but after everything that happened, how did you keep going?" Grace stopped walking and took a deep breath. "I was scared," she admitted. "When Officer Grayson grabbed my arm, I felt humiliated. I felt powerless." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I also knew that if I let fear control me, he would have won. And I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was standing up for something bigger." Amy nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "I hope I can be that strong when it matters." Grace smiled and reached out to squeeze Amy's hand. "You already are." When Grace finally returned home, the house felt warm and familiar, a sanctuary after the long day. She set her purse on the table and turned to see the answering machine blinking with a new message. She pressed the button, and the familiar voice of her neighbor Clara filled the room. "Grace, I just heard what happened." Clara's voice quavered slightly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but I'm so proud of you. So proud. If you need anything, you know I'm just across the street." Grace smiled as the message ended. She didn't feel alone, not anymore. She poured herself a glass of water and stepped onto the porch, sinking into her favorite wicker chair. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the street. As she watched the quiet scene unfold, a car pulled up slowly in front of her house. For a moment, her muscles tensed instinctively. But when the driver stepped out, she was surprised to see Officer Michaels. He approached with his hands visible, an awkward but respectful gesture. His uniform looked slightly wrinkled, as though he'd been debating this visit for a while. "Miss Whitaker," he began, his voice uncertain. I wanted to say something." Grace stood and crossed her arms, waiting. Michaels swallowed hard. "Yesterday, I should have spoken up sooner. I saw what was happening, and I knew it was wrong. But I let fear and loyalty, I guess, stop me from doing the right thing." He looked down at the porch steps. "I'm sorry." Grace studied him for a long moment before speaking. "It takes courage to admit when you failed," she said, "but true accountability is about what you do next." Michaels nodded. "I know. I'm ready to be better." He met her gaze. "And if there's ever anything I can do to help rebuild the trust that was broken, I'll do it." Grace's face softened. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "If we're going to build something stronger, it'll take all of us." Michaels offered a small, grateful smile before heading back to his car. As he drove away, Grace sat back down on her porch and watched the sky shift from gold to a soft pink hue. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Paul. "The town is already talking about what's next. The mayor wants to meet about organizing a community forum." Grace's fingers hovered over the screen before she typed back, "I'll be there." She set the phone down and closed her eyes. listening to the distant hum of cicadas and the soft rustling of leaves. She wasn't naive. There was still so much work to be done. But today had proven that resilience could spark something powerful, that kindness could withstand cruelty, and that a community's voice could drown out fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace smiled to herself. She had no intention of slowing down now. The morning sky over Ridgeway was streaked with soft hues of gold and lavender as Grace Whitaker stepped off her porch, a basket of fresh-baked blueberry muffins in hand. The familiar sound of birds chirping greeted her as she made her way across the street to Clara's house. Clara Thompson opened the door with a wide smile, wrapped in a knitted shawl. "Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour," she teased, though her eyes glimmered with pride. Grace chuckled as she stepped inside. "I figured you could use some breakfast." Clara shook her head as she took the basket. "You're unbelievable, Grace. You've been through so much, and here you are, still thinking of others." Grace shrugged, brushing off the praise. "It's just a small thing." Clara placed the muffins on the table and sat down, her expression softening. "Small things matter. They remind people of what's good." Grace sat across from her, absorbing the quiet warmth of the room. A soft breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying the scent of lavender from Clara's garden. After a moment, Clara leaned forward. "So," Clara said, folding her hands, "what's next?" Grace took a slow breath. "The mayor's organizing a community forum next week. She's asked me to speak." Clara's eyes lit up. "And you're going to say yes, right?" Grace nodded. "I am. But I'm not just speaking for me. I'm speaking for everyone who's ever been afraid to raise their voice." She paused, her voice softening. "And for the people who are still learning how." Clara reached out and placed a hand over Grace's. "You're doing more than you realize." Grace gave her friend a small smile before standing. "Well, I'd better get going. There's a lot to prepare." The days leading up to the community forum flew by. Grace spent her mornings meeting with neighbors, listening to their concerns, and taking notes. Some spoke quietly, unsure if their voices mattered. Others vented their frustrations openly, their words sharp but honest. Grace absorbed it all, determined to reflect their collective hopes and fears in her speech. On the morning of the forum, the air was crisp and clear. The town hall had been transformed, rows of chairs were set up, and a large banner hung above the stage. A new beginning, building trust and unity. Grace arrived early, her heart pounding with anticipation. Paul Anderson was already there, reviewing his notes near the podium. He looked up as she entered and smiled. "You're ready for this," he said, as though reading her mind. Grace took a deep breath. "I hope so." The room began to fill as the clock approached 10. Families, shopkeepers, students, and retirees filed in, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. Amy arrived with her toddler, waving to Grace from the back row. Mr. Reynolds took a seat near the front, nodding in quiet encouragement. Finally, Mayor Caldwell stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for being here. Today marks an important step toward healing and progress." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "But this isn't just about policy or programs. It's about people, our neighbors, our friends, and there's someone here today who embodies what it means to lead with courage and compassion." She smiled toward Grace. "Grace Whitaker." A soft wave of applause filled the room as Grace rose and made her way to the podium. She gripped the sides for a brief moment, grounding herself before speaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice warm but firm. "I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for caring." She glanced across the crowd, pausing briefly as she spotted familiar faces. "When I stepped into that parking lot a week ago, I never expected my life to change so suddenly. I never expected to be seen as anything other than what I am: a neighbor, a friend, someone who loves this town. Her voice softened. But in that moment, I was judged by my appearance, not by my character. And I know I'm not the only one who's felt that way. She let her words settle. The room was silent, every eye locked on her. But something extraordinary happened, she continued. You spoke up. You stood beside me. And together, we turned fear into a call for justice. The crowd shifted, nodding quietly in agreement. Grace's voice grew stronger. This forum isn't about one person's experience. It's about ensuring that everyone in Ridgeway, no matter their background, their age, or their circumstances, feels respected and valued. She gestured toward the officers seated at the back. This isn't about dividing our community. It's about coming together to make it stronger. Accountability isn't a punishment. It's a commitment to do better. Chief Porter nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. Grace smiled softly. I believe in this town. I believe in its people. And I believe that kindness, fairness, and respect can be the foundation of something truly remarkable. She paused, her final words clear and deliberate. Change isn't something we wait for. It's something we build together. The room was still for a heartbeat, and then the applause began, quiet at first, then growing into a standing ovation. Grace stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed but grateful. Paul met her at the edge of the stage, his smile wide. You did it, he said. Grace's heart felt light as she nodded. We did it. The forum ended with plans for ongoing meetings and initiatives, and the energy in the room was electric with possibility. As people began to leave, many stopped to shake Grace's hand or offer words of gratitude. Amy approached with her toddler, who was wide-eyed from all the commotion. That was incredible, Amy said. You didn't just speak, you reminded us why this town is worth fighting for. Grace's smile was warm. We're just getting started. As the crowd thinned, Grace stepped outside into the late morning sun. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air filled with the promise of new beginnings. Mr. Reynolds waved as he passed by, and Paul lingered at the bottom of the steps, waiting for her. Grace took a slow breath, savoring the moment. She felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose, stronger than fear, brighter than doubt. As she descended the steps, the sound of laughter from the park reached her ears. Life in Ridgeway was moving forward, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt like she wasn't just watching it, she was a part of shaping it. The morning breeze was gentle as Grace Whitaker walked through Ridgeway's park, the sunlight filtering through the oak trees above. Children played near the fountain, their laughter ringing out like bells. Vendors set up their stalls for the weekend market, the scent of fresh bread and wildflowers filling the air. Paul Anderson walked beside her, carrying a small notepad tucked under his arm. I still can't get over that turnout, he said, glancing at Grace. The forum was packed, and it wasn't just curiosity, it was real engagement. Grace smiled softly. People needed a reason to believe their voices mattered. Once they saw that, they found the courage to speak. Paul nodded. I think you gave them that reason. They reached a bench overlooking the pond, and Grace sat down, savoring the stillness of the water. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the calm settle over her. The past week had been a whirlwind, filled with meetings, statements, and quiet moments of reflection. She'd received calls from old friends and neighbors she hadn't seen in years, each offering their support and admiration. But despite the attention, Grace never lost sight of what mattered most, ensuring that what happened to her led to lasting change. Later that afternoon, the mayor's office held a press conference to address the town's new initiatives. Grace stood near the back of the small crowd gathered outside, preferring to observe rather than stand in the spotlight again. Mayor Caldwell took the podium, her voice clear and steady. Today, I'm proud to announce that Ridgeway is implementing a permanent civilian oversight committee. the mayor said. This committee will ensure transparency and fairness in all matters involving public safety. It's not just about reviewing incidents, it's about fostering trust between our community and those who serve it. There was a murmur of approval from the crowd. Grace watched as Chief Porter stepped forward, his expression serious but sincere. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, he began. What happened to Grace Whitaker was unacceptable. It was a failure that reflects on all of us, but acknowledging failure is just the beginning. Real change comes from action. He gestured toward the officers standing behind him. We are committed to listening, learning, and rebuilding. Grace felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't naive, she knew this wouldn't fix everything. But it was a start, and starts mattered. After the press conference, people gathered in the square, sharing stories and conversations. Amy approached Grace with a bright smile, her toddler toddling beside her. I wanted to tell you my son said his first sentence today, Amy said, her face glowing with pride. Grace bent down with a grin. Oh, what did he say? Amy laughed. He pointed at his juice cup and said, Mine. Not exactly profound, but still progress. Grace chuckled. They grow up fast, don't they? Amy's smile softened. They do. And I want him to grow up in a place where he knows fairness isn't just something we hope for, it's something we make real. Grace's eyes glimmered. He will. Because of people like you. As Amy walked away, Paul joined Grace again, holding out a cup of lemonade from one of the nearby stands. You've become something of a local hero, he teased. Grace shook her head, her smile modest. I didn't do any of this alone. None of it would have happened without the community standing together. Paul took a sip of his drink. True, but it takes someone to lead the way. Grace gazed out at the square, watching families browse the market stalls and children chase each other around the fountain. The town felt different, not perfect, but better. There was a shared sense of purpose in the air, a feeling that things were moving toward something brighter. As the sun dipped lower, casting the town in a warm, amber glow, Grace headed home. The streets were quiet now, the hustle of the day giving way to the gentle hum of evening. She stepped onto her porch, the familiar creak of the boards beneath her feet grounding her in the present. Before she went inside, she noticed something tucked near the edge of her welcome mat, a crisp white envelope with her name written neatly across the front. She picked it up and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in clean, precise handwriting. Dear Miss Whitaker, I've thought about that day at the pharmacy every moment since it happened. I let my fear and pride cloud my judgment, and I failed you. I failed this town. I want you to know that I'm stepping down from my position as an officer. It's the right thing to do. But more importantly, I'm dedicating myself to making amends not just with words, but with real action. Thank you for showing me what courage really looks like. Jason Grayson. Grace stood still, rereading the words. She let out a slow breath and folded the letter carefully, placing it in her pocket. She wasn't sure what the future held for Jason Grayson, but she hoped his words were sincere. Sometimes people changed when they were shown a different path. She stepped inside her home, setting the letter gently on the dining table. She glanced out the window as the first stars appeared in the dusky sky. The house felt quiet, but not lonely. It felt like peace. The following morning, Grace packed a basket with fresh fruit and a loaf of homemade bread and headed to her neighbor Clara's house. But before she reached Clara's door, she noticed a group of kids playing on the sidewalk, their laughter filling the air. One of the girls, a freckle-faced child with a missing front tooth, waved excitedly at Grace. "Miss Whitaker," the girl called out, "we're playing hopscotch. Want to see?" Grace smiled wide and walked over. "I'd love to." The children giggled as they showed her the chalk-drawn squares, proudly explaining their rules. Grace crouched down, her heart light as she watched them hop and skip, their joy simple and unburdened. This, she thought, was what it was all about, creating a world where every child felt safe, respected, and free to laugh in the streets without fear. As she stood and continued on her way, Grace felt the morning sun on her back and the weight of the past week begin to lift completely. Life wasn't perfect, and challenges would come. But she knew now, more than ever, that resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about rising stronger each time. With each step, Grace walked forward, her heart filled with hope, her spirit steady. The world, as imperfect as it was, felt just a little bit brighter. And Grace Whitaker, as always, carried the light within her. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Grace Whitaker's story, a testament to resilience, kindness, and the power of standing together for what is right. If this story inspired you or made you reflect on the strength of community and the importance of speaking up, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to experience more uplifting narratives filled with hope, perseverance, and heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue sharing stories that shine a light on the best parts of humanity. See you next time.